Shalom and blessings. I'm Rachel Corey, and this is prophecyviewpoint.com. Today we're going to talk about a battle, a major battle, the Battle of Gog and Magog. It is the very final rebellion in the history of sin. Revelation 20, verse 7 and 8. Now, when the 1,000 years have expired. That's very important. That is the timing. Satan will be released from his prison. Well, when was he imprisoned? 1,000 years before. What happened 1,000 years before? The second coming. And he will go out to deceive the nations which are in the four corners of the earth. Well, how did there get to be nations in the four corners of the earth if the plagues destroyed every single thing on the earth at the second coming? Well, that would mean they had to have been resurrected. Yes, and there will be a huge resurrection. The resurrection of the nations, the greatest resurrection of all time. Gog and Magog. Satan will be released from his prison, will go out to deceive the nations in the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together to battle, whose number is as the sand of the sea. There's so many of them, billions of them. They went up on the breadth of the earth, surrounded the camp of the saints, the beloved city, and fire came down from God out of heaven and devoured them. Let's look at the history. Second coming. There will be a great resurrection. Daniel 12, verse 2 and 3 says, multitudes will be raised from the dust. Some to everlasting life, others to everlasting condemnation. You don't come back from everlasting condemnation. That's a done deal. So those who have lived in rebellion against God, against His law, up to that point in time, they will hear judgment pronounced against them, and they will be cut off and destroyed on that day. Their bodies will be consumed in the fire which will burn up the earth. And I would just say, if you are joining us for the very first time at this website, please go back and listen to the foundational studies. If you don't understand that the dead are not conscious, that the dead are asleep, they do not go directly to heaven or to hell, then please go back and listen to the study titled, Where Are the Dead? If you don't understand that the concept of eternal conscious torment in this place called hell was an entirely manufactured, Satan-inspired concept, please go back and listen to Hell, What It's Not. Listen to the study, Millennium. It's all about the trumpets and the last plagues and what happens to this earth at the second coming. Listen to A Kingdom of Priests, so you'll understand, if you are one of the redeemed, what your destiny is. Lay some foundation. All right. The redeemed at the second coming, raised from the dead, go with Christ to the place which He has prepared in the Father's house. They will be consecrated to serve as priests under Christ for all of those who will come up at the great resurrection of the 8th day. The earth will be totally desolate and without life during the 7th or Sabbath millennium. After the Sabbath millennium, after the 1,000 years, when the 1,000 years are completed, the redeemed of Israel return with Christ their King. They return to the land. They restore the waste places. They rebuild the ruined cities. All of that is in the study at the website titled The 8th Day. So many prophecies about the return to the land. They raise up a city on Mount Zion and a temple. It's the temple which Ezekiel the prophet saw. And then the healing river flows out from this temple, and the earth will come back to life. Animals, fish, birds, and people. Those raised at this time will be those who were not called of God during the first age, during the first 6,000 years. They will be those who, because of immaturity, disability, or just circumstance, those who could not make an informed choice for the Lord, they will be raised after the 1,000 years. They are the rest of the dead who live again, who are nations in the four corners of the earth. All of those people, they will be educated and governed by the priests under Christ. They will learn the truth that God is, the truth that He has a law which is non-negotiable. Many of those raised at the 8th day will come up to the city. They will give their allegiance to Christ as Savior, as Lord, as King. They will learn His ways. They will choose to walk in His paths. And Christ will even take some of these people for priests to help govern and for Levites to work in support of the temple. That's Isaiah 66, verse 21. In Isaiah 66, they're called sons of Zadok. Well, the sons of Zadok were priests who were loyal to King David when Absalom rebelled. That's 2 Samuel 15, Ezekiel 44, Ezekiel 48. They were all a type of the 8th day priests who were loyal to King Yeshua Messiah. Loyal when Satan leads a rebellion. Ezekiel 39 verse 27. When I have brought them back from the peoples and gathered them out of their enemies' land, then it says the Lord will be hallowed in them in the sight of many nations. So that puts the nations right there with Israel brought back to the land. And I'm not talking about DNA descendants here. This has nothing to do with DNA. This has to do with faith. Faith Israel has always been the true Israel, not just DNA descendants. So Satan is released after the 1,000 years. Why is Satan released? Well, because the contest for souls is not yet finished. If the fate of all mankind was decided at the second coming, then why turn Satan loose again to deceive them all over again? Why not just throw him in the lake of fire and be done with them? The fact that Satan will be released so this contest will continue tells you that everyone hasn't made up their mind yet. It goes back to the original contest between Christ and Satan for the hearts and minds of intelligent beings. Satan demands the right to test each one, and God's justice requires that all be tested. They have to make a choice. You cannot just flow into the kingdom without doing anything. Their motives have to be made manifest by their actions, and the reason for that is because they will finally be judged by their actions, which tells you right there they're going to be judged by their fellow beings, not just by God himself. Because he knows the hearts. He doesn't need to look in any books. So it follows that the multitudes who are raised to life following the 7th millennium have not yet been tested. They have to learn of Christ, learn of his ways, and then they have to make a choice. They have to choose to serve him or to rebel, and that's what the great battle of Gog and Magog is all about. It's a rebellion. It is a rebellion of those who were raised after the 1,000 years who have not chosen Christ as king. I want to read through Ezekiel 38, 39. I want to read through this description of the Gog-Magog battle because there are only 2 places in Scripture that talk about the Gog-Magog battle. One of them is Revelation 20, but the other one is Ezekiel 38. Now, Revelation 20 tells you this is after the 1,000 years. Ezekiel just tells you it's after Israel is returned to the land. And it's interesting because there's a resurrection in Ezekiel 37. You know, all those dry bones and the flesh comes back on the bones. And then they're raised up. So the resurrection comes first. And later, once Israel is returned to the land and is dwelling safely in the land, then this battle takes place. And no, I'm sorry, I do not believe the current nation of Israel over there in the Middle East fulfills the prophecy. Because they don't even believe in Christ, 90% of them. More than 90%. 90% are secular. They don't believe much in anything except themselves. So, I just don't believe that a very small number of the descendants of Jacob fighting their way into a portion of the land promised to Abraham fulfills the prophecy. I think it's a counterfeit for the fulfillment of the prophecy. And we'll talk about that one of these days too. But for now, let's look at this rebellion of Gog and Magog. Ezekiel 38, verse 2 to 6. This is in a vision. Human being. Now he's speaking to the prophet Ezekiel. Human being, turn your face toward Gog of the land of Magog, chief prince of Meshach and Tubal. Prophesy against him. Say that Adonai Elohim says, I am against you, Gog, chief prince of Meshach and Tubal. I will turn you around, put hooks in your jaws, and bring you out with all your army, horses and horsemen, all completely equipped, a great horde with breastplates and shields, all wielding swords. Paras, Ethiopia, and Put are with them, all with breastplates and helmets. Gomer with all its troops, the house of Togarmah in the far reaches of the north, with all its troops, many peoples are with you. Now remember, this is prophecy, and it may include some symbolism. And the ancient nations, the peoples, the tribes, the leaders, they may simply represent the enemies of the Lord in this account of a future battle because they were enemies in the past. I don't want to say that all of the participants in the Gog-Magog battle are all direct descendants of these particular Middle Eastern tribes. Gog is a very strong leader, controlled by Satan himself. And the Lord says that he will put Gog, pull him towards this battle in a way that he cannot resist. But see, God always assumes the responsibility for what he allows Satan to do. There's a study at the website titled The Wrath of God, A Different View, that goes into this. That God always accepts responsibility for what Satan does or what evil men do. He assumes the responsibility because he allows it to happen. Continuing, Ezekiel 38, verse 7 to 9. Prepare yourself, Gog. Get ready, you and all your crowd gathered around. Take charge of them. After many days have passed, you will be mustered for service. Well, how many days have passed? 1,000 years. In the later years, you will invade the land which has been brought back from the sword, gathered out of many peoples on the mountains of Israel. They've been lying in ruins for a long time. But now Israel has been extracted from the peoples, all of them living there securely. You, Gog, will come up like a storm. You will be like a cloud covering the land, you and all your troops and many other peoples with you. So when it says the latter days, some people are pointing to the time prior to the second coming and saying that this battle of Gog and Magog will take place just prior to the second coming, and it will be Armageddon. But that's not what Revelation says. Revelation says it's after the 1,000 years. And the 1,000 years follow the second coming. Continuing, Ezekiel 38, verse 10 and 11. Adonai Elohim says, when that day comes, thoughts will well up in your mind, and you, Gog, will devise a sinister scheme. You will say, I'm going to invade this land of unwalled villages. I will take by surprise these people who are at peace, living securely, all in places without walls, bars, or gates. I will seize the spoil and take the plunder. I don't know if you've read the news lately, but Israel is not a land living in peace. And they actually do have walls and bars and gates. So this doesn't seem to apply to the current nation of Israel. Continuing on, verse 12 and 13. You, Gog, will attack the former ruins that are now inhabited and come against the people gathered from the nations, who have acquired livestock and other wealth and are living in the central parts of the land. Sheva, Dedan, and all the leading merchants of Tarshish will ask you, have you come to seize the spoil? Have you assembled your hordes to loot, to carry off silver, gold, livestock, and wealth, to take much plunder? Verse 14 to 16. Therefore, human being, prophesy. Tell Gog that Adonai Elohim says this. Won't you be aware of it when my people Israel are living in security? You will choose just that time to come from your place in the far reaches of the north, you and many peoples with you, all of them on horseback, a huge horde, a mighty army called Magog. And you will invade my people Israel like a cloud covering the land. This will be in the latter days. And I will bring you against my land so that the Goyim, the Gentiles, will know me when before their eyes I am set apart as holy through you, Gog. The Lord said the same thing of Pharaoh and the Egyptians. by means of his victory over Gog, just like his victory over Pharaoh, he would be set apart as the only one. Outside of the city are dogs and sorcerers and sexually immoral and murderers and idolaters and whoever loves and practices a lie. Revelation 22 verse 15. So these people in the land of Israel, when Gog invades the land, this mighty horde coming up, they're going to run into the city for protection. That's what they did in ancient times, and that's what they will do again. So on the outside of the city are the wicked, and on the inside of the city are those who have given their hearts and their allegiance to Christ as King. Continuing, Ezekiel 38, verse 17 to 23. Adonai Elohim says, I spoke of you, Gog, long ago through my servants, the prophets of Israel. Back then they prophesied for many years that I would have you invade them. When that day comes, when Gog invades the land of Israel, my furious anger will boil up. In my jealousy and my heated fury, I will speak. When that day comes, there will be a great earthquake in the land of Israel, so the fish of the sea, the birds in the air, the wild beasts, all the reptiles creeping on the ground, and every human being there in the land will tremble, will shake before me. Mountains will fall, cliffs will crumble, and every wall will crash to the ground. I will summon a sword against him, against Gog, throughout all my mountains, says Adonai Elohim. Every man will wield his sword against his brother. I will judge him with plague and with blood. I will cause torrential rain to fall on him, his troops and the many people with him, along with huge hailstones, fire, and sulfur. I will show my greatness and holiness, making myself known in the sight of many nations. Then they will know that I am Adonai. If you look back more than once, the Lord so terrified and confused the enemy troops that they actually fought against each other. That's what it means when it says, every man will wield his sword against his brother. He's talking about the enemy who will turn against each other. The battle of Gideon against the Midianites is one such battle in Judges 7:22. Continuing in Ezekiel 39, verse 1 to 5. So you, human being, prophesy against Gog. Say that Adonai Elohim says, I'm against you, Gog, chief prince of Meshach and Tubal. I will turn you around, lead you on, bring you from the far reaches of the north against the mountains of Israel. But then I will knock the bow out of your left hand and make your arrows drop from your right hand. You will fall on the mountains of Israel, you, your troops, and all the peoples with you. I will give you to be eaten up by every kind of bird of prey and wild animal. You will fall in the open field, for I have spoken it, says Adonai Elohim. Verse 6 and 7. I will also send fire against Magog and against those living securely in the coastlands. Then they will know that I am Adonai. I will make my holy name known among my people Israel. I will not allow my holy name to be profaned any longer. Then the Goyim, the Gentiles, will know that I am Adonai, the Holy One in Israel. Isn't this interesting that fire will rain down upon lands which are distant from Israel and the main battle site. Every rebel will be destroyed, along with all of the supporters of those rebels. Reminds me of the story of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. Though distant from the main confrontation, all of those who were rebellious in heart were destroyed. The story's in Numbers chapter 16. What gets really interesting is the cleanup after the battle. Isaiah 66 verse 24 says, "And they shall go forth and look upon the corpses of the men who have transgressed against me. For their worm does not die and their fire is not quenched, and they shall be an abhorrence to all flesh." You know, Jesus quoted this passage in Mark chapter 9, verse 44, verse 46, verse 48. He's talking about the wicked people from this battle. Ezekiel 39, verse 8 to 10, continuing with the battle of Gog and Magog, with the cleanup. "Yes, this is coming and it will be done, says Adonai Elohim. This is the day about which I have spoken. Those living in Israel's cities will go out and set fire to the weapons to use as fuel, the shields, breastplates, bows, arrows, clubs, and spears. They will use them for fire for 7 years, so that they will not need to gather wood from the fields or cut down any from the forest, because they will use the weapons for fire. Thus they will plunder those who plundered them and rob those who robbed them." You know, he's putting this in very Old Testament language, shields and spears, but really, if you think about it, this is a space age war here. They could be building nuclear weapons, and the atomic energy from those weapons might be used as fuel. Never know. The burial place, Ezekiel 39, verse 11. "When that day comes, I will give Gog a place there in Israel for graves, the traveler's valley, east of the sea. It will block the traveler's passage. There they will bury Gog and all his horde, and they will rename it the Valley of Gog, the Valley of the Horde of Gog." Continuing with verses 12 to 16. "It will take the house of Israel 7 months to bury them, in order to cleanse the land. All the people of the land will be burying them. They'll be famous for it. It will be a day for me to be glorified, says Adonai Elohim. They will then pick men for the continual duty of going through the land and burying with the travelers," meaning all those who traveled over the land with Gog Magog, burying the corpses still laying out in the ground in order to cleanse it. They will begin their search after 7 months. As they go through the land, if anyone sees a human bone, he'll put a marker next to it until the grave diggers have buried it in the valley of Gog. Moreover, Hamonah will be the name of the city. Hamonah means its horde. Thus they will cleanse the land. I have been reading from the Complete Jewish Bible, which has the Hebrew names. So this fire of God kills the rebellious, but it doesn't char them or consume the bodies completely. It doesn't consume all the bones. So this explains why the survivors are described as burying them, burying the bones, burying the bodies. It explains why the bodies at the second coming are left unburied. It explains why the vultures will feast on the dead after the righteous have left at the second coming, because there'll be no one to bury them. That explains why the bodies of Nadab and Abihu, who were slain by the fire of God, why their bodies were carried out of the courtyard by their tunics. Leviticus 10, verse 5. The fire of God kills, but it does not completely consume. So it's not fire in our earthly sense of the word. It doesn't cremate them. I know that many believe that the current nation of Israel is the fulfillment of the promised return. And they see that nation as if it's been resurrected. It's like its dry bones come back to life. But I think it's a counterfeit. I believe that Satan will use these circumstances to deceive the very elect. I believe there will be a terrible attack that will threaten to destroy Jerusalem, probably involving Muslim nations, along with Russia and perhaps a few others. And some miracle will save Jerusalem. Fire will come down from heaven, as it were, with weapons. And many will call this the Battle of Gog and Magog. And destruction of the Temple Mount may open the way for a third temple to be built. And then the abomination of desolation will stand in this defiled holy place. Antichrist can make fire come down from heaven in the sight of men, and he will demand worship sitting in the holy place, saying that he is God. It's a counterfeit. I just do not agree that the Battle of Gog and Magog will take place prior to the second coming. There's only one Battle of Gog and Magog, and it is clearly fought after the 7th millennium. Revelation 20, verse 7 to 9. Now, when the 1,000 years have expired, Satan will be released from his prison, will go out to deceive the nations, Gog and his army Magog, to gather them to the battle. So Gog Magog is not the same as Armageddon. Growing up, I was taught that only the wicked would be raised after the 7th millennium, that they would be resurrected to face judgment and then execution. I just don't believe this anymore. I just don't believe it. If multitudes of those who sleep in the dust of the earth are raised to shame and everlasting contempt at the second coming, that's Daniel 12, 2 and 3, if they're cut off from the people of God, if they're left to die in the plagues, and their bodies are burned up with the earth, isn't that execution enough? They die fully aware that they're lost, that their death will be eternal. Why resurrect these same people again 1,000 years later to do it over again? And if these are the same people, well, how could Satan fool them into thinking that they could overthrow Christ? They've already seen him in glory. They know he is invincible. And I was also taught that the fire which destroys Gog and Magog is the lake of fire that follows the great white throne judgment. I don't believe that anymore either. The way it reads in the book of Revelation, the final great white throne judgment is a separate event which follows after the Gog-Magog battle. And we're going to examine that final judgment in a study titled Final Judgment, Lake of Fire. Let's talk about the greater Exodus. Jeremiah prophesied a greater Exodus. Jeremiah 16 verses 14 to 21 and 23 verses 3 through 8. He said that the greater Exodus would make the first one look very small by comparison. Now, I don't think that the greater Exodus refers to the return from Babylon, because far fewer Israelites returned to the land after the Babylonian captivity than came out of Egypt. And I don't think it refers to this current occupation of the territory, the nation now called Israel by DNA descendants, because those were very few in number, and they're not being taught of God. 90% of them are secular. They're not moving in faith. So if we're going to understand this predicted, prophesied greater Exodus, then we need to look to the first Exodus to understand the dynamics. At the first Exodus, one group who came out of Egypt was accompanied by another. Israel was accompanied by the mixed multitude, a people of mixed races who had been slaves in Egypt. They followed Moses into the wilderness. By the end of the journey, these people had either been incorporated into Israel or they had died in the wilderness. Israel were the chosen. They were circumcised. They were called the congregation. They were in covenant. They were written in the book. They were sons of the kingdom. They were rich in the things of God. The mixed multitude, on the other hand, coming out, they were not the chosen. They were uncircumcised. They were called strangers, aliens. They were not in covenant. They could enter into covenant if they became circumcised, physically circumcised, they're males, then they could partake of the Passover, which was a covenant meal. Then they could come to the temple, they could offer a lamb. They would be the same as Israelites. All right. During the wilderness wandering, this mixed multitude was taught of God. And one law applied to both Israel and the mixed multitude. One law. At the future Exodus that I see, now this is Rachel's opinion here. At the future Exodus that I see, again, there are two types of people living on the earth. There's Israel, and by this time they are priests of God. They are circumcised in heart and in flesh, meaning they have immortal spiritual bodies, and they may enter the temple that Ezekiel saw. The mixed multitude, on the other hand, are the nations. They have mortal bodies. They have not yet been circumcised. They may not enter the temple. And by the end of the future Exodus, these nations will have been taught of God, taught of Yahweh. One law will apply to everyone. They will have chosen to serve him, chosen to abide by his commands, or they will have rebelled, just as the first mixed multitude rebelled in the wilderness. If they choose to serve Yahweh, then they will be circumcised in heart and in flesh by Lord Yeshua. They will receive immortal spiritual bodies. But if they rebel, they will die at the battle of Gog and Magog, just as the first mixed multitude died in the wilderness. In my studies of the enemies of Israel, I discovered that Only the captives of Egypt are promised that they will be gathered and returned to their land. I used to think this referred to Israel because they were captives in Egypt. But if you look at Ezekiel 29 verses 13 to 15, it's talking about the enemies of Israel. And, why only the captives of Egypt? Why not the captives of Babylon or the captives of Assyria or Rome? I believe it is because the original mixed multitude were called captives of Egypt, because they were slaves in Egypt with Israel, and they left Egypt with Israel. They stood at the foot of Mount Sinai. They were taught the law. They did not remain ignorant. So if the original Exodus is the model, then the greater Exodus should include a greater mixed multitude, and I believe it does. The nations raised in the last great resurrection, also called the rest of the dead. These are the future mixed multitude. Jeremiah, in his judgment on the nations, calls them all the mixed multitude. And he's talking about the nations. Jeremiah 25, verse 15 to 17. And did you know there was also a mixed multitude at the return of the Jews to the land from Babylon in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah? It's Nehemiah 13, verse 3. How interesting. The Gog-Magog battle is a rebellion during the 8th day, the 8th millennium. And it's a rebellion of those who were raised last, who refused to be taught of Yahweh or to walk in his ways. Just like the original mixed multitude heard the 10 Commandments, this rest of the dead will hear the law of God. They just do not want to follow it. So, at the 8th millennium, they will no longer be ignorant or uninformed. They will be taught. Many of them will enter into covenant with God through Christ. In the type, Caleb. You remember the story of Caleb and Joshua, the two of the spies who said, yes, we can do it with Yahweh's strength. In the type, Caleb was one of the original mixed multitude. Did you know that? He was a Kenizzite, meaning a descendant of Kenaz, who was a son of Esau. The references for that are Numbers 32, verse 12, Joshua 14, verse 6 and verse 14, and Genesis 36, verses 8 to 11. I have wondered if Enoch might be a type of those from the resurrected nations, the rest of the dead, a type of those who enter the city of God at the 8th day. They're taken by God. They're given new spiritual bodies. And now they're sons of God. I see parallels here. Some would say, oh, Rachel, you're reading too much into this. I would say to them, you're reading too little. Multitudes of those raised at the last great resurrection, like the sand of the sea, it says. They will resent the reign of Christ. They will be deceived by Satan into thinking that they can overthrow the rulership of Christ. And they will come up to attack Jerusalem where Christ sits as king. God will then defend his city. Fire will come down from heaven and it will consume them. And the cleanup will take 7 months for the bodies and 7 years for the weapons. Fire is a repeating prophecy. At the second coming, the earth will be burned up, it says, and the wicked along with it. At the Gog Magog battle, the rebellious will be consumed by fire from heaven. And at the final judgment of the dead, all of those who at that time are dead, the lost will be consumed in the special lake of fire. In the first two events, living people are destroyed on the earth. Our next study will continue with the third and final fire event. Let me leave you with Proverbs 11, verse 31. Behold, the righteous shall be recompensed in the earth, much more the wicked and the sinner. Revelation 22, verse 14. Blessed are those who do his commandments, that they may have right to the tree of life and may enter through the gates into the city. Until next time, I am Rachel Corey, and this is prophecyviewpoint.com. Until next time, shalom and blessings.